Hello and welcome wherever you're listening to and now watching 2020 Coaching Conversations, 2020 Coaching Convos, as usual with me, Julie Crabb. You've joined me on the second series, which I've called Passionately Curious, and in which I'll be exploring questions and ideas about the language and jargon of coaching. As the title strongly suggests, I'm simply curious, and I want clearer and deeper understanding for myself and hopefully you and others about coaching language to reflect on and to make sense of what I've been taught and what I've learnt and what I've adopted as a coach. And importantly to me, and the original purpose of this podcast or broadcast now, to ensure that coaching is available to all who want to make use of it. If you haven't yet heard last week's introductory episode, which is audio only, I'd encourage you to go back and just take the 5 minutes it takes to hear more about the background to this episode and where it all started. So, the labyrinth, the metaphor for the series. Then starting this second series, Passionately Curious, this time about language, I've realised that the discussion and the debate that I'm about to embark on is going to feel a bit like the labyrinth in the grass that Sarah Bramall described in episode 20 of series 1. So you might remember that next to her house, there's a church in the grounds of which someone has cut a kind of a grass maze. So in this series, I can clearly see the entrance to this labyrinth, the start, if you like. And I generally have no idea where I'm going to end up. Though, like the labyrinth, there definitely will be an end. There's only between 8 and 10 episodes planned for this shorter series this time. And then in the labyrinthine debate of series 2, there will likely be, as you get in a maze, twists and turns and possible confusion and disorientation, a bit of revisiting of previously trodden paths. On some occasions, I think we're going to be positively skipping along and sometimes strolling and sometimes pausing for a bit of a breather. And I'm entering into this maze with partial knowledge, so there could be a very direct, a very simple direction to take, some really simple answers to my questions. Or perhaps there are, in fact, like the maps of the world that we own, or we generate, and our perceptions, several paths that might be taken with some element of rightness or value or insight in some way. Anyway, enough of my whimsical thinking. And I was thinking also there's, of course, the danger in talking about language of overthinking and becoming uber aware of my own choices of words and phrases here in this series too. But again, like the maze, I'm really drawn in, despite the nagging thought that this is really quite straightforward. I'm drawn into the potential that there might be debate. I'm drawn into the possibilities of rich reflection and comment that I imagined would. And thanks to Max Kemp, actually, and Paola Kringle, it has already emerged. So there'll be more of that in the next week's episodes. So the purpose of this series, why it's important to me and why I think it's important to coaches and potential clients, and some thoughts about context. So here's the thing, as I hear a lot on the radio and in podcasts these days. This series is aligned really closely to two of my certain solid qualities and values, and they are of learning and connectedness or connection. And of course, communication, connectedness, and rapport are essential in coaching conversations. So I've been increasingly interested over the past few months in the way in which I hear myself and fellow coaches use professional language or jargon. And I feel I kind of want to preface this by saying again that this is in no way intended to be disrespectfully critical of my own trade and service, but more to kind of be reflexive and develop myself in my practice and to share this with others. So for myself, even as I mature in my coaching practice and I observe that my identity and philosophy of being a coach is quite strongly becoming evident as part of just who I am, and in many aspects of my life, I'm still finding there are phrases and terms I use in coaching practice that I truly don't use in any other context. So is it simply professional language, and is it simply contextual? And as I've been thinking about this, I remembered I've had similar experiences at other times and in other contexts of my life too. So here's just a couple. So in the 80s stroke, or in the early 90s, I worked in a psychotherapeutic community for severely disturbed adolescents. And I would be challenging that label now, I have to say. The unit that I worked in was internationally renowned, and it was one of very few training centres in its field available at the time. So here too, in this setting, there was a culture that kind of included a language of expression unique to that setting, and which I learned in order to assimilate. And it would have been little understood outside of that context. In fact, it would have sounded quite extraordinary outside of that context. And then in a different example, in religion too, in my teens, I was what was referred to as a born-again Christian. And although that religious group was really inclusive, so there were pretty well no entry requirements to the club, as it were, at least not obvious or spoken. And the language there was contextual, it was cultural. So in each of these contexts, the language seems to signal kind of like a special knowledge and understanding, and maybe a means of describing belonging. So a question might be, don't all professionals have this, including their own language of sorts? It appears in other areas of our life, but maybe it's about professional language. And in a professional context, maybe it's being argued as essential for getting things done around here efficiently, generating a sense of collegiality, or just shortcutting complex explanations. But what concerns me in those examples I've given, and I don't necessarily believe it's deliberate or conscious, is that the contextual language, the professional jargon we might use, is potentially exclusive, even as you saw in that religious example I described, and excluding and inaccessible to those who are not in the know. So in order to belong, must we assimilate language, at least to a degree? And so this, I think, is an important topic for coaches, qualified and in training, and for potential clients. And over the course of this series, given some recognition of context, I'm expecting to learn about what is the value for coaches in using professional language and jargon, and how we might ensure it's not in any way excluding in its nature. The more obvious solutions and responses. So most coaches would say they don't use professional jargon in a session with a client who's not a coach themselves, or with whom they haven't kind of previously explored the jargon, and yet we can still slip into it. Even, and here we go with the coaching terminology, even in a chemistry or strategy call with the client. And as coaches, we have our own kind of favoured trip off the tongue terminology. And we also have our least like jargon as well. In fact, I asked some fellow coaches on a WhatsApp group about their least like phrases, and big picture, let's unpack, digging deeper, who can you reach out to? What I'm hearing is they were mentioned. One person who kindly responded is definitely going to be irritated by the title of this series, because they said, I dislike, I'm curious about. My personal least favourite is showing up. When I quickly Googled this, showing up is to arrive somewhere in order to join a group of people, especially late or unexpectedly, or to expose or discredit. And in other descriptions, of course, more aligned to coaching, it means intentional, it means open, skillfully challenging yourself to get the most out of every situation. And whilst that description is a bit more helpful, it's still open to interpretation. So between coaches, we use phrases like holding space for a client and getting out of our own way. And I can't help but wonder what people with more concrete ways of thinking make of the meaning of these. So do we all or each know what we mean? And how often do we ask each other or check it out? If you're a coach listening to my musings here, you might already be shouting the more obvious solutions at your listening device. I can kind of imagine people going, this could be simply solved by avoiding the use of jargon and professional language. or if we would only clarify with each other or seek understanding or check for similarity or difference of meaning, or if we just listened well to use the other person's language. So there's a simple answer. Just don't do it. End of series 2. Well, that's one truth, I guess. But let's have a little look at content or process. I think I've missed the card. There it is, content or process. Before I muse about content and process, I'm going to digress a bit here, only because I'm reminded of a program I heard on Radio 4 about midwifery. Bear with me on this one. I think it was a series called The Child. There was some research being discussed, and it was about the proliferation of prenatal scans being requested by pregnant women. And the research was called Putting the Baby Back in the Body. The main theme of the research was really about safety and risk, but there were a lot of kind of sub-themes to it. One of which was that the women in the study relied on the scans to make the baby feel kind of real to them. And they only became more confident in their capacity to sense their baby after they experienced the first fetal movements. And the research proposed, and I'm kind of quoting here, the fostering of confidence using individual palpation of the abdomen by the midwife with the women supported their individual sensory experience. So before rebuilding the relationship between baby, midwife, and mother, seeing was believing rather than feeling. So the suggestion is that we have, initially, like when we moved from radio to TV and now to digital devices, we've moved more towards predominantly highly visual representation systems, so mostly visual in our sensing. And so mothers, generalization alert, expectant mothers are now less connected with baby and sensations of the baby's presence in the womb, is what the research was suggesting. So although this is kind of a diversion of sorts, I was interested to hear that perhaps in modern society, we are less auditory and so perhaps pay less attention to the sounds we hear in language, let alone achieving understanding of meaning. But maybe that's for another whole series, I guess. I might pick the idea up in a later episode, but I'm curious to know your thoughts. Anyway, back to content and process. In some coaching techniques, especially in NLP, we worry less about the language and the thought content to focus much more on the process. So do we even then need to have a shared understanding of language? So in content or process, which is more important or more effective for the client to aid their thinking and feeling and to access the resources that they need? Even resources, there's a kind of a Damon Cart self-concept style of language. But in coaching practice, we might ask what the client means by a particular word that maybe to us seems intuitively significant or is being repeated by the client in the conversation. Or we might use the client's language back to them without the sense of need to check understanding. The client, after all, is doing the thinking and the feeling around the phrase or the construct or the word or the experience that the words bring them, not the coach. And I'm thinking about the books that I've referenced before on the levels of simplicity of language by authors and practitioners like Nancy Klein and Claire Pedrick and Judy Rees, amongst others. Personally, I'm drawn to that simplicity, not simpleness, but the simplicity of the ideas in those texts. And I recognize really that the art of reflecting back is not in any way simple. Done less well, it can be experienced as robotic and irritating. But done really well, and this is my own experience, it can be a useful auditory kind of echo mirror for the client. So from my own experience, I'm on the side of process here. So let's move on to thinking about how knowing about or experiencing any kind of similarities or differences in the meanings of words or phrases used by others can help us in coaching. And that's, yes, the sameness or difference that forms kind of part of our meta programs as they are described in NLP terminology. So what value is there to be taken from similarities and differences in the meaning of language used in coaching? Even when we know the person's definition or explanation of the meaning that they take or make or intend by a word or phrase, don't we then filter even that explanation through our own lens? So we kind of generalize that explanation to suit our own map of the world, as we might say, in then upbeat terms. And how do we manage or make use of these observations as a coach? And it raises even more questions for me, questions, that I might be trying to hold myself in a coaching session consciously or unconsciously. So perhaps when a client explains their meaning of a word or phrase, I might be thinking, how similar or different is that meaning to mine? Or how did that person come to have a different way of making that meaning and expressing themselves? Or where is this going to take the coaching conversation or thinking, possibly in a direction like the labyrinth, which is unfamiliar to me? And does this matter at all? And my inclination is that it does not. Next week, I'm definitely going to share what to mind is on my mind, is a beautifully articulated response to some of these ideas from Max Kemp of Max Kemp Coaching, and also straightforwardequitation.co.uk. So yes, I'll share her thoughts back, which she gave actually from the audio, the introductory audio, and we'll see what other thoughts that prompts too. So the value and art of curiosity. How can curiosity help? I was listening to a podcast by Mike Blissett in the week, and I heard him use the phrase skin in the game repeatedly. And this was such an unfamiliar phrase to me. I hadn't heard it before. So after several repetitions, curiosity had me look it up, and then even more questions came. How can I understand Mike's choice of that phrase in the context of the podcast? And what experience led Mike to use that particular phrase? And did he have a purpose or intention for me as the audience in the repetition of that unusual phrase, at least unusual to me? It is true too, isn't it, that language we use gives us tells, another piece of jargon, about the communicator. So this could, I guess, be useful in language if we remain openly curious, but without presupposition or judgment, which is really hard if you're trying to make sense of the tells. But language tells or can tell about our beliefs, our values, our role, our status, our education, our ease in the communication or in the subject matter or the situation, our origins, our intentions in relation to the person we're communicating with, and so much more. So to be curious about language used surely increases our understanding of each other and indeed ourselves. Many of my aha moments when I'm being coached myself have gone from something I've spoken out loud, but when it's mirrored back or repeated back to me, somehow gives what I've said a new power or energy and allows me to see a different perspective and emphasis that wasn't apparent to me before. So I'm just going to give you an example of what I mean there. In a recent supervision session, I was struggling to describe or get to the bottom of a concern. Let's not delve into that turn of phrase, but I kind of rambled off into a description of my experience of interviewing a tennis coach, of all things, of all people. And I was recounting how she observed how the younger children that she coached were less concerned with competition and just with, and then I paused, and then the joy of being here was what came out of my mouth with an expression of realization. And in that moment, that was exactly what I'd been looking for. So it was the process, not at all the content of my ramblings, which had achieved my outcome. So drawing it all together, whatever next? And curiously, the entrance to the labyrinth is now out of sight. I think we've walked far enough for this week. We've walked through context, content, process, who owns the language, curiosity, what and where's the value, and in the coach's understanding and in sense making between the coach and the client in the coaching conversation. I think to finish, I'm going to pose a couple of questions from my reflections and musings to see what thinking and feeling might have, forgive me, come up for you. I might be just being a bit provocative there. So here's the questions. If you are a coach, what value does professional language and jargon hold for you? So what value, does professional language and jargon hold for you? If you are a potential or existing client of coaching, and I realise you might be in position to answer both this and the previous question. So if you're a client, in what ways does coaching language and jargon impact your attraction to or experience of coaching and coaches? And my last question, which I think I might adopt repeatedly throughout this series, what am I missing? What am I missing? The classic what else question. Oh, and by the way, the title for the series, Passionately Curious About and First Up Language, was based on a quote of Einstein's, to which I find I can sometimes relate. He said, "I have no special talents. I am only passionately curious." Paola Kringle of Isle Thrive Coaching, that's such a smart business name. She's based on the Isle of Man. She dropped a note to me following the introductory session, and she said, "What an interesting questions you posed, Julie, and what a great topic for us all to get passionately curious about. Language and how we use it is fascinating. And what I'd encourage you to do, please, is post your thoughts and comments. I'd love to know what you think and feel about anything in this episode of 2020 Coaching Convos Series 2, Passionately Curious About Language, or in answer to the questions or anything else that comes to mind as a result. I'm also going to post the questions out to coaches who guested on Series 1 episodes. And with this rich mix of replies, I'll create next week's episode to expand on thoughts and questions. So next week, there'll be feedback from other coaches and quite likely some reference to my current reading of Six Blind Elephants by Steve Andreas. So please share the episode, subscribe if you enjoyed, and tell me what you want to hear more about in 2020 Coaching Convos with me, Julie Crabb. Till next time.